Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Plotlines. I'm your host, Connor, and today is a glorious day uh, in my life, and that's because I get the chance to interview His Imperial and Royal Highness Ambassador Archduke Eduard Habsburg. Welcome to the show, your ambassador.
Thank you, Connor, for having me on Plotlines.
Yeah, it's this in some sense feels like it's been in the making for my entire life. I've had a great love of the Habsburg dynasty since fifth grade.
Wow. How come? How did you
Uh,
discover the Habsburgs?
I was it's oddly connected to the American Revolution, which doesn't make sense. But we were learning about the American Revolution in fifth grade, and the way my teacher taught it got me so interested in history. And then she suggested to my mother a bunch of history books to read. They were very basic history books, but they went through like across like all of history basically, so from uh from ancient history to modern history. And for me it had a lot of pictures and stuff like that because I was fifth grade. It wasn't like a thick textbook necessarily,
Mhm.
but the Habsburgs stood out in that book, as well as the Holy Roman Empire.
You would probably appreciate Jonathan Singleton's book on the American Revolution and the Habsburg Empire that just
There's a
came out, I would say, a year ago or so, or two. I mention
there's
it at the end of my book.
Oh yeah, there's a book about that. Wow, that's
Yes,
amazing.
there's a book about the influence the American Revolution had on the Habsburg lands. Very
Oh, okay.
interesting read. Very interesting read.
Yeah, well, I'll have to get to that. Well, first of all, behind you is the image of your book, the Habsburg Way, seven rules
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 for
for
turbulent
turbulent
times.
times.
Yes.
Yeah, I was able to read it, and it's an absolute great book to get a chance to read. Now, being someone who read a lot about the Habsburgs, it is a great refresh in a lot of ways, and it also gives a very good gives very good like short stories. I feel like it's kind of a compilation of short stories. Is that a good
Yes.
summation?
Yes, it's a very good summation. My idea was to do two things at the same time, give you a chance to get to know the main characters of our family history mostly through stories and anecdotes that will stick to your mind, but not just write a history of the family, but also try to find out what are the core values, the core principles, the rules that our family always followed over 800 years of history, and how would it be to apply them today, and why are we not following these things anymore? And I began thinking about all that. But my major thing is I want to tell really cool stories about my family, because there are great stories to be told in the Habsburg family.
Yeah, no, very, very, very true. Thank you for writing it. First of all, it's wonderful to also get the perspective of a member of the dynasty in such a form.
Yes, it's very important that I pointed out at the beginning. I didn't want to write a new comprehensive history of the Habsburgs. There are very, very good histories of the Habsburgs out there, very useful, extremely well written by Martin Rade, the new one, for instance. So didn't want to do that. I want to, write a personal love letter to my family, but also give you something in the hand. For instance, I have an opening chapter where I give you 5 dates that you need to memorize about the family, and then you can talk with competence about the Habsburg family. So I know people don't have much time. Reading a book with more than 3 pages is a call for many of us. But that's why I also accompany the whole thing on Twitter with my Habsburg championship.
Yeah,
So I
that
try to,
whole
I really try to make the Habsburgs more easy to grasp for today's audiences. And if you give me a book with 400 pages, You will have to convince me to begin to read. But mine, it's slim. Everybody can take it out, and it looks really beautiful. Absolutely love this cover.
Yeah, the cover is absolutely amazing. Uh, yeah. So why are Habsburg principles important in this day and age?
Well, first of all, the Habsburgs are a family that seems to be loved. I have a feeling of love for the Habsburgs all over the world. There's a reason for that. We don't have a history of violence. We don't have a history of intrigues. We are not bloody warlords that have conquered countries. We are mostly known for bringing countries together and making them live peacefully by marriage politics, by faith, by justice, by all these topics that appear in my book. And you ask yourself, if something went really well for several hundred years, um, then there must be something in it. And now we look around us, we don't see monarchies anymore. We see monarchies in a few countries in Europe. These are constitutional monarchies. They are in the way of shadow of what a monarchy used to be. And none of them is a real traditional Catholic monarchy as the Habsburg monarchy used to be. And when I think of all that, I ask myself, what happened 100 years ago? Was it good that all these monarchies went away, but also was it good that all these principles that come from and stem from these monarchies have been more or less put onto a dusty shelf, as I feel it sometimes. And then I look at our world today and I realize many people have the feeling, especially in the last 3 years, that 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 we don't know what our politicians are doing with us. We are not certain who makes the decisions worldwide. All these sort of worries that creep up. And I felt that a few parts of what the Habsburgs try to do in their countries might be an answer to these worries and might even be an answer to the problems we have today in politics. So I wrote this book.
Yeah, I really do agree that the Habsburgs have a lot to give, and I'm very glad that you provided a way of understanding the Habsburgs in this manner. Because I might be willing to read a 400-page book on the Habsburgs, but you're right. There's that may not be uh, the situation for everyone.
I'll give you one or two examples. Nowadays, when we walk mostly through Europe, in the States it's still a bit different, but here in Europe, you walk through the countries of Europe, you don't see any politicians in positions of prime minister or president who seem to be married or to have children or grandchildren. If they have them, they hide them really well, but many of them aren't. You don't see family among our leaders. In the Habsburg in the Habsburg lands, you always saw a family at the leaders. You knew about all the 12 children that were born. You knew where they married. You knew how they looked like. You saw family life lived in front of your eyes by the respected leaders of your country. And you said to yourself, well, if they can have a family life and if they follow these values, then I can have that too. Nowadays, if you decide to found a family and have more than 1.5 children, you feel like you have to exclude yourself. You have to explain to other people why you do something so crazy. Why you, for instance, don't prioritize work life and having two cars instead of one. Um, when we got married, my wife and me, and my wife worked before that, but she decided to stay at home and be a stay-at-home mom. She said, it's really unthinkable for me because I had to explain to all my friends. I had to really explain it to them. They looked at me and said, "Why?" So if you have, if you have political leaders that are visibly family people, then this will be different. We don't have that anymore. We don't have that anymore. I come from a country, Hungary. Our prime minister shows himself with his family. Our president, Kotlin Novak, was not only our family minister, but is married and has small children and shows herself with them. And many of our politicians show that they are family people. This is just one example. Another example is said, well, it's a story I like to tell about Blessed Emperor Karl, our last emperor. Now, Blessed Karl, in the eyes of the world, would probably be seen as one of the greatest losers in the Habsburg family. He took over the empire 1.5 years before the end of the First World War. He desperately tried to make peace. He lost the war. The empire ended with him. He went into exile and he died of a disease on an exile island of Madeira very short after that. And he tried twice to come back to Hungary, and both times it failed. So this is the classical loser in the eyes of the world. But at the same time, he's a giant in our family and a giant of faith. Now, why do I talk about Blessed Karl? I could talk for hours, but this is, of course, not the topic of our talk today. When he was in exile and he suffered for what was going on in his countries and he couldn't help, he once looked over to the church on the hill, and then his wife saw him say, yes, yes, I will do it. And then later on, at some point, she asked him, what did you say there? And he said, I promised to God that I'm ready to give my life so my people can have peace. And then he began to have this illness and was in bed and had terrible pain, terrible suffering for weeks. And his eyes were always on the Blessed Sacrament, which was outside his room. And he offered up his sufferings, his life, his disease, and his death for his people. Now tell me one politician nowadays, which would do something like that. Most of our politicians have a career. Then they leave their career where they serve the state and go into business and make some money and make more money and don't have the responsibility anymore for the country. The Habsburgs never had the choice to step out and say, that's it, thank you very much. I'd like to have a nice and calm evening of my life. No, and the decisions you make will influence the ones your son or your daughter have to make. So what I'm trying to say is we have values here and we have an attitude towards serving your country that we seem to very often be missing. Now, there are good politicians, they are great politicians, but our system does not encourage such an attitude. And this was something that was normal 100 years ago. So I asked myself, why is it not normal anymore today?
Yeah, leaders who serve are not are a dime a dozen uh, at this point. Because and even you mentioned going into a different career after being a politician. A lot of politicians, at least in the United States, seem to have made so much money from being a politician that they don't even need a career.
Yes, yes. In fact, the Habsburgs never considered themselves rich. I mean, of course, if you're a king or an emperor, you're somehow rich. But money was never the central thing in the Habsburg history. It was justice, it was family, it was faith, it was empire and subsidiarity, a topic that's very important, and a topic I think among the words I'm talking about in my book, subsidiarity is probably the most important for our times and for the political trouble that we feel in our time. And if you agree, Connor, I will talk a bit about that. Now, that's also one of the points where the Holy Roman Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the United States of America are very close. This is one of the greatest surprises when I wrote this book. I realized how close some of the Habsburg thought and some of what the United States are built upon are to each other. And one of those things is the so-called subsidiarity. Now, what does subsidiarity mean? I don't really have to explain that to an American because America is built with the idea from grassroots up. America is built on the smallest unit. It's built on the family, on the home, on the township. Above that, the county is already more fuzzy. The state should be even more fuzzy. And the whole federal level should be something very, very distant because we all know that human beings are made for the close society around them. It's very difficult for us to have ideas about global things. So a good state is one that respects the lower levels. And subsidiarity says that the higher level of organization should not take over duties that can be better done by the lower level of an organization. Which means, for instance, in the United States, that the central government should not mingle and mix in things that the state can do better. And that's the great thing about the United States. The states really have power still and can do things differently from the federal government, which is strong. It's a strong thing. Same thing went for the Habsburg lands in the Holy Roman Empire, of course, but also afterwards in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Um, you try to respect in every country the languages, the laws, the privileges, the different nationalities, the habits in the country, and the Habsburgs were very good at that. And whenever they tried to do it differently, whenever they tried to do a centralistic empire, it always went terribly wrong. And that's why, and if we look at the European Union today, for instance, the problems that we sometimes feel within the European Union is always when we feel that Brussels centralism is trying to put their fingers into our local affairs, which we can judge best for ourselves. We're a sovereign nation. But there is a strong, if you have a center, if you have a centralistic power, the tendency to amass power and take more power is always there. This is how bureaucracy works. And this is, I think, why subsidiarity, the respect for the lower level, the respect for the single unit is very, very important today.
Yeah. Also, for Americans, that word usually is associate or would be usually used federalism. Usually, people use federalism.
Yes.
Subsidiarity, the word itself, is too Catholic for the United States. I think so that it's not as used as much. But yeah, no, it's definitely a principle. At least it's a principle that we tell ourselves we have. It's not something it seems that our politicians necessarily have, but it's definitely a principle of the Constitution and of the past for the United States. And I think a lot of people do hearken back to that often. Now, you mentioned Blessed Karl being to the world a loser, but in so many ways he's the biggest winner of the family because he's a blessed. He's the only
Yes.
Habsburg that's a blessed. It's and the greatest stories are ones uh of of heroically standing for for the faith uh and your people and not giving in. There are so many stories of people giving in. Those aren't the heroes of the story. The heroes,
Yes.
just because you lose your empire doesn't mean you are it usually means you're the hero of the story.
Yes, absolutely. I was a script writer in a former life, and I've written novels. So that fits to the title of this show, Plotlines. And a friend of mine who was also a script writer said that the greatest stories are epic, are epic stories where in the end the hero dies but has stood for his values. I mean, uh, we treat it a bit in Christianity because Christ died for everything he stood for and for our sins, but he, of course, rose from the dead. But what I'm trying to say is, Blessed Karl is really a soft-spoken giant of faith. I see so many young people take to him in the United States. That's the craziest thing. America has no monarchistic tradition. I mean, there are monarchists there, and it's perhaps easier to be a romantic monarchist if you never had a monarchy on your continent.
Well, we did. We just overthrew him, unfortunately.
I don't think it really counts because the
Oh,
United States formed themselves without the English monarchy really interfering. And but what I'm trying to say is, I spoke in Dallas last year on Blessed Karl. There were 700 people in that conference hall. Half of them were young, many families with small children, 50 babies, and they loved this man, this soft-spoken, not imposing-looking man, who looked, like something very small and kind beside this overtowering statue of an emperor that had ruled before him. And but of course, what he did, and we have a WhatsApp group in the Habsburg family. We live in 2023 too. So, and I once made a poll in that Habsburg group where I asked our younger family members, "Who's your favorite Habsburg?" As I'm doing it now on Twitter, where people can vote. I believe in democracy. People can vote for their favorite Habsburg. So I asked them, "So what's your favorite Habsburg?" And I threw out a few names. Maximilian, Charles V, Franz Joseph, Maria Theresa, all those names. And nearly all of them voted for Blessed Emperor Karl. And I said, why? Why would, what you would call a loser in the world, why would he be the star? And one of them answered, I think it's a beautiful thing. He said, because in his faith, in his vocation, family life, and in his job, which he happened to be emperor, he tried to be very, very good. And this is something that every one of us can do. Not all of us are emperors, but you can live your job, your family life, and your faith life with all you have, with love, with dedication. And that's what he did. And that's why he can be an example for all of us. Most of us are not called to sit on a throne, I'm pretty certain. But many of us may be called to family life. And whatever job we have, as a diplomat, I'm trying to fill this job with love, with care, with faith, with prayer. This is something we can do. So I think this is one of the reasons. Of course, he is a blessed of the church, like is a venerable of the church, the other member of our family that made it to venerable, and hopefully one day we'll make it to blessed or saint. And that is Magdalena, Venerable Magdalena of Austria. She was a beautiful daughter of Emperor Ferdinand I. He wanted to marry her off, of course. She was brilliant, very intelligent, very devout. And in her youth, she was painted by Archimboldo. You can see it on my Twitter championship. Really fantastic painting. So she was that
link your Twitter in the description so people can follow you.
That's very kind. So and then one day she decided, no, well, all her life she had a relationship with God, and one day, influenced by Saint Peter Canisius, the famous Jesuit saint who was her confessor, she decided she wanted to found a monastery, become abbess, and with two of her sisters. And the father said, of course, no way, I have plans for you. We can send your youngest sister, she's weak, but you I need to marry off. And then, of course, in the end, they prevailed. She founded a monastery, and she was one of the champions of Counter-Reformation in Tyrol and in the Austrian land, and she helped very strong. She was one of the major people bringing back the Catholic faith to Austria. And it's because she followed her vocation, even in the face of opposition from her father. Wonderful, wonderful woman. And but this is just two of the saintly ones we have. We have just people who are brilliant emperors, with people who are great lawmakers, very courageous soldiers. We've got a great mixture.
Yeah. So kind of going back to sort of the beginning of the dynasty, you're focusing, on piety and, faith. So how do you think Emperor Rudolf set the tone for the dynasty when it comes to piety, with him giving up his horse for his lord? Like, how do you think that factors in?
Well, I would say Rudolf established at least two of the things that I write about in my book. Well, several. I would say several. Three, at least, of the 7 points. But I would begin with, you're right, in faith matters. He gave a great example because while he was a rather tough soldier and he waged wars when necessary, he was a devout man. And when he was still a count in Switzerland, before he became emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, one day he was hunting in his forests, and a priest arrived with a viatic, with the body of Christ to bring to a dying person. And the river was very strongly swollen, and he couldn't cross over on foot as he had planned. So Rudolf gave him his horse and asked him to take it to get to the dying man. And so the priest sat on the horse, crossed the river, went to the dying man, and came back about 3 hours later with a horse and wanted to give the horse back. And Rudolf said, "This be far from me. that I will ever sit again on a horse that has carried my lord. And the people in the area heard about this story, and they said, this is a man that is called to greatness, and God will reward this. And of course, he rewarded it with him being the first of our family to sit on the throne of the Holy Roman Empire. And the same Rudolf also, people always ask, why did Habsburgs do this marrying politics stuff? Other monarchs didn't do it that much. Habsburgs, it was their chief way of putting countries together and of bringing peace. Simply because when you are emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, you have to juggle so many different countries, nationalities, languages. Princes, kings, dukes, rich and poor, and you cannot just, like evil emperors in movies do, climb on the table or take your army and kill them all. But you have to keep all of this together. It's an incredibly complicated diplomatic chess game on 3 levels. And one of the best ways to keep peace between countries and to make peace also between enemies is to make marriages between your children. And Rudolf did this already before he became emperor, but also afterwards. He had one chief adversary, that was Ottokar of Bohemia. Ottokar of Bohemia was the most powerful other prince elector, and he had, in the 25 years of interregnum when there was no emperor, he had occupied large parts of Austria and kept it for himself, which he couldn't because that was country that belonged to the empire. So Rudolf tried with negotiations, with talking, whatever he could, to convince him to give it back. And one step was he tried to offer his daughters to marry to his sons, to solve it that way. But Ottokar wouldn't have it. In the end, they had to duke it out in the greatest knightly battle of the Middle Ages of Dürnkreuz, and Rudolf carried away the victory and the day, and that's the beginning of our great story. So that's another one. Be brave in battle is one of them. Rudolf did that. Marry and have many children. Rudolf did that. Believe in the empire and subsidiary. Most definitely did that. Be Catholic. Most definitely did that. Then we have, know who you are. Tradition. Then you have die well. And then you have stand for justice. Rudolf re-established the law in the Holy Roman Empire. Rudolf, I would say, is among the 4 or 5 Habsburgs that stand for nearly every point of the 7 rules that I set out in my book.
Yeah, I think one of the other reasons why people love the Habsburgs is they always seem like the underdogs.
Yes. Well, and not really. There was a time when they weren't the underdogs, during Charles V, when we ruled an empire where the sun never set. We weren't really the underdogs. But
I'd still make the argument that actually the Habsburgs were still the underdogs in that situation.
Well, somebody once calculated, and I think it's in Martin Radi's book, that all the income from the New World, all the gold and all the silver, didn't even amount to, I think, a third of the income of the French king.
Yeah,
but the Habsburg grew the far larger. So perhaps you're right. And it's nice to be the underdog.
Yeah, no, the Habsburg family, the continuous underdogs. It's
very nice.
Triumphs. The triumphs tend to be miraculous.
Yes, absolutely, and but most of all, they were really a nice bunch. I had to reread a bit all of the family history, and if your philosophy is getting married and having many children, and you will automatically be a nice family, and they always were, I think. I mean, a few of in my book, I ask pardon of all our non-Catholic readers of my book, because I'm sometimes rather enthusiastic about members of my family, sometimes using more violent means to ensure the Catholic faith in their countries. But that, of course, was a sign of love. As Ferdinand II once wrote, if I wouldn't care about my subjects, I would leave them in their error. But I love them and their souls, and therefore I try to save them. So that's a different attitude.
Yeah, that's one thing that a lot of people don't understand about Catholics, and
Yes,
a lot of Catholics don't understand about their own faith, is that it's kind of really rude to be like, I don't think you deserve the faith.
yes,
You know.
exactly. But
Um,
as I say in my book, if you live in a time where everybody goes to heaven, and we know that everybody goes to heaven, and as somebody once said, my ancestors, my Habsburg ancestors, lived in constant fear and worry whether they would make it. They knew they were sinners. They knew that there was going to be a judgment, not only for their personal lives, but also for how they behaved as emperors and with the responsibility they had. And therefore, they worked all their lives to ensure that they would make it to heaven. Nowadays, of course, some people say that the only thing you need to go to heaven is to die. And everybody goes to heaven because at every funeral, the priest always says, well, he's now with God. And we don't know
yeah.
this, of course. We don't know this. My ancestors were not sure whether they were going to make it. And therefore, all their life, they tried before God to do the best they could because they would have to one day, render accountability for what they did in their life. And that is a special situation that our politicians now, they're not worried anymore because they're going to go to heaven anyway. And also they can step out of their career and don't have to be worried with the country anymore.
You just explained why I can't stand going to most funerals these days. It's like a torture for me. It's like I'm just thinking, Father, why are we here if you're right? Like,
Yes,
what are we doing
absolutely.
here? Why would we have a
Yes.
mass for them?
Well, we want to remember them, and I understand Father. Father thinks his family is grieving. They went through something terrible. They are sad. I don't want to put more trouble on their shoulders. So I'm going to say nice and cuddly things. And I understand it. It's a very nice impulse. But imagine if you really believe in life after death, and if you believe that we can pray for our dead, we Catholics believe that, you can give the grieving family something that they can do, something that they can do for the deceased. And instead of just we'll remember you, which is absolutely ridiculous because all remembrance passes. Um, all tombstones on cemeteries at some point won't be visited so often. This is not something to console us. We can console ourselves with knowing that our loved one lives with God or can make it to God if I pray enough for them. That is great. So all those things were very very clear to the Habsburgs. There's a very nice story in my book again, where one of the daughters of Maria Theresia got smallpox, and smallpox had two possible outcomes: you died, or you survived, but you were usually scarred and not beautiful anymore for the rest of your life. So it was a terrible thing, and smallpox passed through the Habsburg several times. And in that case, one of the girls got it. She was 12 years old. And the first thing she said, she was asking to send a priest to her so she could make a life confession. That was the first priority. Not even am I going to be beautiful or whatever. It was, I want to make a confession, a full confession. She died a few days later. And the man telling us this is not her confessor, it's her father. And her father was uh, Franz of Lothringen, Franz Stephan of Lothringen. And he was the only Freemason we had in the family. He was not a very, very devout man. He was a more humanistic Catholic, and but he was deeply impressed by that girl making this first step and saying it's about my soul. And this is something the Habsburgs, with very few exceptions that I speak about in my book, always did from the beginning to the end. They were very aware of their mortality, as should we be. Because some people think I will turn to faith just before I die. When I lie on my deathbed, I will begin to pray. But it's like with jogging. You have to do the jogging for a long time until you can do jogging without breathing, without losing your breath, and without, this is something you cannot learn on your deathbed. Your faith must be exercised over your entire life for it to work in those last hours or minutes. You have no idea under which circumstances you will die. You don't know whether you will have 10 seconds or because a car crashes into you, or whether you will lie on a deathbed for weeks and not be able to move a finger. You don't know. You don't know. So your life is preparation for that moment. And the Habsburgs were very aware of that.
Yeah, being conscious of our mortality as well as where our soul may go after death is very important. The last thing I'll say about the funeral part is just that uh like 9-year-olds, if a 9-year-old dies, like and you then say like the like it's not as much of a tragedy when a 9-year-old dies. Like you're
It's a, it's a, it's a very important question that you're asking, Connor. It's, half of the children used to die before the 19th century, often in families.
yeah.
And you think like they must have gotten used to it by then. And you had so many, but it was a horrible tragedy every single time. They
Mhm.
suffered so much about the death of these children that they barely knew. I mean, I can imagine it. It was absolutely unthinkable if one of my children had died. And the few people I know who lost a child, this is incredible grief. But and, and that's on the other hand, it's the wonderful part of our family is there is a family's family. We, through I had to stop not to write the entire book about how Habsburgs lived family, which could be a future book. Um, it
One-eyed
was
reed.
it was just something as you imagine it. The Hofburg under Maria Theresia with 16 children who all spoke, well, officially in the court, they spoke French, of course, as one did in the 18th century. But among themselves, they had this Austrian simple way of speaking, and there was a lot of noise, and there were lots of children everywhere. And Maria Theresia was an incredibly lively, powerful, cheerful woman. She danced, she rode, she played cards. She uh, there's a famous story when her when one of her daughters had, I think, the first grandchild, and she learned about that. She was in the Hofburg, and she ran through the Hofburg, and she crashed onto the balcony inside the theater there, and there was an opera being shown there, and she just interrupted that and lifted up the letter and says, "My daughter has just had a child," and everybody got up and cheered. So this is something I can feel a bit of that. I only have 6 children, not 16 like she had, but we live family very intensely. It is the greatest gift that you can have. If God gives you a great spouse, and you can form a family, and God gives you the incredible grace of having children. And if you begin early enough and have lots of them, because 1.5 children is not going to give you a big family experience, even if it's probably more rational and makes more sense because everything else is so expensive. There is nothing greater than sitting around the table with your 6 children and watching them and just saying, "What have we done? What have we done?" And on the other hand, the beauty of seeing the interaction between all these different characters in the family, seeing the siblings, the younger siblings learning from the elder ones leading the younger ones, looking after them, like for instance at our table we always handed the weakest, the youngest one, food first. Sometimes the elder ones were really angry because they were so hungry, but they had to learn that the younger one gets first. So all these things you learn in a big family. I think it must be very difficult to learn all these values, all these basic building blocks of democracy too, to learn them if you're alone at home with your parents, and it's so much easier if you have siblings.
Yeah, very true. Uh, yeah, no, it's family is incredibly important, and if you have the opportunity to marry and have kids, that's very important. Also, if you're worried about money, just take heart that God will provide. I think that's we fear too much. We're not supposed to live in fear, and that's what prevents people from having big families these days.
Also, all your material wealth can be taken away from you like this.
Yeah.
And we lived according to the rule, and there's a beautiful German saying which I have to translate into English now, but in German it sounds so cute. Schenkt der Herr ein Häschen, schenkt er auch ein Gräschen. If the Lord gifts a tiny rabbit, he will also give the grass. And this is what we experienced very often in our life. There were points where we thought, how is this going to continue? and then somehow it worked, and something came along, and the Lord looked after you. My mother always used to say, you look after the Lord's things, and the Lord will look after your things. So you work on your soul, on your relation, on your vocation, and God will look after the material things. And the Habsburgs were, I think, always like that.
Yeah. You talked about Ferdinand. Is it the second who recatholicized Austria?
Yes.
So
Yes.
how else has the Habsburg family been the protector of Catholicism and even broadly Christianity?
First of all, there was a point in the 16th century where it looked like the entire empire would become Protestant. And the Habsburg emperors at that time were really weak souls. Ferdinand I was still halfway Catholic. Maximilian II was most definitely rather Protestant, as was his son Rudolf II, who was in Prague. And it got a bit better, but not much, under Matthias, Rudolf's brother, who took over from him. At that time, the Habsburgs did not fight for the Catholic faith. In a way, you can understand it. If you're the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire and suddenly half of the princes under you and electors are Protestant, you feel like you have advisors who tell you, oh, make them compromise, give them something, and it's a temptation. And Ferdinand II was the first one of the Habsburg emperors to strongly take up the flag of the Catholic faith again. And he's also much maligned for that. Many people can't stand him, says he was a bad emperor because he sort of put the faith before state reason. And Henry Kissinger in his book Diplomacy, when he writes about Cardinal Richelieu. And Cardinal Richelieu basically said, I would make a deal with the devil if that would serve the state. I don't have to be Catholic in that. And he was a cardinal. And he never understood Ferdinand II, who didn't make small concessions to the Protestant princes under him, and would have had peace in the empire. But he didn't, because he believed that he was a Catholic emperor. And this is impressive. Now, he wasn't the only one. I spoke about Magdalena, that was his aunt, but it continued. The Habsburgs, Leopold I, for instance, for me is a beautiful image. Leopold I was like the most Baroque Catholic emperor who lived with his family and his courtyard. The entire Catholic year, he began his days with 3 holy masses. He followed 3 masses, reading along in the missals. And he made processions. And the entire family was with him. There's a beautiful painting in the Rochuskirche, St. Roch's Church in Vienna, Landstrasse. And you go in there, and on the left, on the wall, there's a painting where you see the city of Vienna. And in front of it, you see the emperor, his wife, his children, and on the other side, all the other children, kneeling and praying. Which is, the message is, your emperor is Catholic, be Catholic too. It is good to be Catholic. And then the entire court celebrated those processions and Catholic feasts with him. And of course, the greatest historian is, of course, the ambassadors, because like me, I'm ambassador to the Holy See, to a very Catholic institution. I spend a lot of time in holy masses. I would say at least 1 or 2 masses per week that I attend of colleagues of the Vatican, where I go officially as my work. It's part of my work. I'm being paid for going to Holy Mass. And but the French ambassador at the court of Leopold I, he wrote a letter home after the Easter celebrations, and he said, "This is unbearable." I'm making this with a French accent. From Palm Sunday to Easter Sunday, I've been kneeling 100 hours. And so you knew you were the Catholic court. The court knew it, and the population knew it. The entire city lived this faith. And, the emperors before birth went to pray in the Augustiner Kirche. All women in the empire knew that the empress was going to do this. Maria Theresia, when her labor began, she ordered a prayer, rosaries, and adoration with exposed sacraments everywhere in the empire. This is something that shapes a people. And sometimes nowadays we call politicians devout Catholics, but we sometimes feel I would like to see a real devout Catholics giving an example to people. And when I had my Prime Minister Orban here in Rome visiting the Pope, and he's not a Catholic, he's a Calvinist. When he came to Rome to visit the Pope in last August, he told me, I want to go to Catholic Mass before we meet the Pope. And I said, we can arrange a Hungarian Mass in the basement of St. Peter's Basilica. We have a little chapel there. He said, no, I want to go to the normal Mass of the normal people, pay my respect by going to Mass. So his wife is Catholic. They both went to Mass. They sat there, they held hands during Mass. This is a couple that is married a long time that impressed me. I sat directly behind them, they held hands. And he knelt down and she knelt down during consecration. He didn't go to communion because, of course, he's a Calvinist and he knows he shouldn't do, but he knelt during consecration as a sign of respect. Now, this is a politician, a leading politician, a head of government that shows how important faith is. We have lost that a bit, and I don't see it very much in Europe. The Habsburgs stood for that.
Yeah, no, that's beautiful. I want to ask something about your relationship with, you knew Crown Prince Otto, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Did you ever ask him about the possibility of him becoming King of Spain? I think if I'm not mistaken, Franco asked him or offered it the throne of Spain at some point. Did you ever ask him about that, or was that ever a topic of conversation?
I never asked him, and I think that he knew in every fiber of his body that his responsibility was with Central Europe, with Austria, with Hungary, with the neighboring countries. The story of Otto and what happened to Peter and Otto's siblings and him in the years after the death of Blessed Karl is an incredible story, and you have to read it in my book. You can also read it in more detail in Charles Coulombe's book about Blessed Karl. And what do you do if the empire is ended and you're a Habsburg? What is your duty? What is expected of you? Do you fight with all your power for a restoration of the empire? Or do you find that something else might be asked of you in these times? And at the beginning, especially in the Second World War, he very strongly tried to do everything to help Austria with his connections to the United States, keeping the Allies from bombing certain parts of Austria, trying to get better treatment for prisoners of war from Austria, and doing everything that Austria could be free one day. So that was his way of doing this. And there were a few moments where there was a slight possibility of restoration in the air. So that must have always been on his mind. But after the war, he probably realized that the closest thing to doing your duty as Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire or the Austro-Hungarian Empire is to fight for a united Europe under Christian principles, to bring the countries together. That's what he did for the rest of his life. And he very clearly always included the countries that were at that point behind the Iron Curtain. So he insisted that there were always a few empty chairs in the European Parliament in order to symbolize the countries who could yet not be part of this parliament. I remember the time when he told me about this, and I thought, dream on. This communist bloc will never fall. This will be here forever. We all thought that in the 80s. We couldn't imagine it to go away. And then it went. And all those countries are now part of Europe and European Union. So really, what Otto did was show you how to use your powers in a time when there is no emperor and no empire and you don't rule. And this is a question that every Habsburg has to ask themselves. I've been handed down something, a few ideas, a certain DNA, and certain things that my ancestors stood for. What does it mean today? Does that mean try to become king somewhere, or does it mean something very different? And this is what every Habsburg has to figure out for themselves. What is clear is that we always stand a bit in the limelight. We stand on a stage. Whatever we do, people will see what we do. They will listen to us. They will believe that we have answers to certain things. You have to learn to become a Habsburg. But this is what happens, yes, since about 100 years in every generation of Habsburgs. And I answered the question by becoming a diplomat, and by working for the peace between countries, where I can bring together my faith, my belief in the living together of nations, many ideas that the Habsburgs stood for.
Yeah. I mean, this is kind of a silly question because we can't see the future, but should we be expecting a restoration anytime soon?
Somebody once said, history does not repeat itself, but it rhymes. I think it's a beautiful image. We have no idea what crazy curveballs history will throw us. And sometimes I believe that in a few years we will laugh out loudly about what we thought that would happen in the future and what actually happened. Crazier things have happened. Right now, I don't see a monarchy popping out of nowhere in Austria.
Mm-hmm.
In Hungary, there is a stronger tradition. The crown is still very visible. The Hungarians are very kind with the Habsburgs. They have two Habsburg ambassadors, for instance.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but the monarchy is not something that you can decree. It is something that has to grow out of the population. There has to be a strong consensus. And you have to feel that a monarchy is the right answer to the situation we live in, the best for the country at the current situation. For instance, I wouldn't advocate for a monarchy in the United States because America has a very, very strong founding myth and a very strong system without having a monarchy. Although my friend Charles Coulombe would probably disagree, because he even wrote a book. He wrote a book about a very funny book called the Star Spangled Crown, and it's a book written, in retrospective, where it says how quickly it happened. It's a very, very funny book. But what I'm saying
it's a
is,
very good book, in my opinion.
yes, 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 I love it, I love it. But what I'm trying to say is that's a complicated question you ask. Of course, I write at some point in the book that what we have in our DNA is to serve our countries in some way, and if ever a monarchy would come back, we probably would be happy to serve and to help along. But I I look at today's constitutional monarchies and I ask myself if a monarchy has a monarch that is basically a glorified president with a crown that has to read the speech that his prime minister writes for him and has to sign every law that his government presents to him, then I can understand President Roosevelt. President Roosevelt went to visit Emperor Franz Joseph in Vienna in the Hofburg. They had a 38-minute talk, and at some point of this talk, Roosevelt asked Franz Joseph, a bit ironically, saying, like we have parliaments and politicians and elections. What exactly is your job as an emperor? And Franz Joseph answered, my job is to protect my people from their politicians.
Yeah.
And I sometimes ask myself, who protects us from our politicians? Who protects us from our political system? Who doesn't have to think 4 years ahead to the next election and weigh every word that you say in order not to become unpopular? Yes. So there are always arguments for monarchy. There are monarchies, and some good countries are monarchies. And that's a long and complicated answer to your question.
That's a great answer. I agree with you on the last part, especially the what good is a monarch when they don't have any, if they have to do everything the prime minister says in that circumstance. I brought it up, or the American part interesting. I saw a lot of people floating the idea that they'd want you to be the American monarch if we ever had one. And I so if you want a swell of support someday, not specifically for you, but just in the sense of monarchy, people
There
are
is an
people are
old
talking.
tradition. There is an old tradition for countries who want to become monarchies to
inviting
call
Habsburgs.
upon a younger member of another family. This happened a lot in the 19th century.
It
But
did.
as I said, I think the United States are a fantastic system. They are built by an incredible spirit. The more I'm again rereading on Democracy in America by Tocqueville, America has the potential to be a force that can, right now, in many ways, heal and save the problems we have in the world. Through the elements that I speak about in my book, The Habsburg Way, we're very similar in this. And therefore, I don't really see a monarchy coming on, even if some countries in the United States, like Florida, California, and Texas, are old Habsburg countries.
Hmm.
And if we ever come back, we will come through one of those countries.
Okay, awesome. Well, my final question for you is, how is it being part of a government that seeks to protect the family and solidarity?
I'm very proud to be ambassador of Hungary to the Holy See. You don't have to, as an ambassador, agree with everything your government does. In fact, a good ambassador is also doing his job really well when he doesn't agree with everything his government does. But I happen to agree with everything my government does. I found that out after I became ambassador, and that I really agree with everything, and that my government, in many ways, I see it in the current crisis about Ukraine. I see it in the topic of migration. I see it in the topic of family, of sovereignty, um, gender ideology. My government gives me courage to speak up more courageously than I probably would as a cautious Catholic that never wants to step onto anybody's toes. Um, so it's wonderful to be Hungarian ambassador. It's always fun because, say, you're the ambassador of Belgium or Portugal. People will say, but if you say you're the ambassador of Hungary, they say, Hungary. Well, I have a question for you. So it's never dull. It's always fun. We have an impossible language. We have a beautiful flag. We have the most beautiful anthem in the world. The Hungarian anthem is so beautiful that I cry every time when I sing it. Um, so yeah, it's cool to be ambassador of Hungary. It's very cool to be ambassador to the Holy See. I'm thankful to God that He brought me here. I wasn't always ambassador. I was scriptwriter too and spokesman for a bishop, so I was many things. But I'm in the best place in the world right now, and I hope to stay here for quite some more while if God allows. And Prime Minister Orban.
Wonderful. I know Prime Minister Orban also wrote a foreword for your book.
Yes, yes,
So that's exciting. So if anybody doesn't know, you have a YouTube channel. You don't use it that much, but you
no,
do. You do. So I will share that as well. All this is. I'm just very honored to get to talk to you like this, and after meeting you in Dallas last year, it's a pleasure talking to you, and really thank you for your time.
Yes. Thank you, Connor, for inviting me for your great podcast slash YouTube show. And I wanted to say, if people want to reach out to me and interact with me, you can really do this on Twitter. I only have like 58,000 followers, and I still can answer every single direct message. And I nearly always manage to answer all the reactions to my tweets. I enjoy this still. At some point in the future, it won't be possible anymore, but I still can. So if you want to interact with the Habsburg, don't hesitate to follow me and try to talk to me. And again, thank you for this talk. We had a few very, very good and interesting questions and conversations, I feel. I hope not too controversial for your American friends.
Well, to be honest, I think uh, controversy sells. um, but yeah, no. Also, you're very much a man of the people on Twitter, so thank you for that. And also, do your books, you have two in English. You have the Habsburg Way, and you have your children's book.
Yes,
I know there are others that are in different languages. Uh,
yes.
will those ever be translated, or will you
If
ever
I'm really,
translate
really
them?
famous and make a lot of money, they will probably be. I wrote a little book about James Bond. I wrote a little book about Harry Potter. I wrote books about castles. I wrote 2 or 3 novels in German. But I think if you read the Habsburg Way, and if you buy your children Dubby, the double-headed eagle, which is a very quaint and fun way to get to know our coat of arms, the double-headed eagle, then you'll have fun.
Yeah. Awesome.
Thanks,
Anyways,
Connor.
thank you. And oh wait, I forgot. I have to show you a meme before we go.
Please show me a meme.
You might have already seen it, probably you have, but let's see.
Yes. we we could have an entire show about Habsburg jaw, Habsburg chin, and all the things that people throw at me on Twitter. This is really fun. I haven't seen it. I haven't seen it.
I think
This is
it's
a new
hilarious.
one. You have
Yeah,
to send it to me. I'm collecting these.
I will. I'll send it to you. Awesome. Well, thank you everyone for that. For watching. Please like, share, comment, and subscribe. Also, I'm on Rumble, just in case I get taken down from YouTube. So thank you everyone, and God bless. Bye.
Bye.